section of your blue pew Bibles on page 39. Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. Listen now for God's word to you. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians, and she spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that the power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, but only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know of this, and told them to give her something to eat. This is the word of God for you, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Jesus has just returned from the other side of the Sea of Galilee. This is both literal and metaphorical. Jesus does literally cross over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee and enters a region known as the Gerasenes. But it's metaphorical in the sense that Jesus crosses the boundary between us and them and interacts with Gentiles who are different from him culturally and religiously. What happened over there on the other side wasn't exactly a stirring success. Jesus did heal a man who was suffering greatly in body, mind, and spirit, but that healing upsets the locals. They didn't really know what to do with this formerly possessed and oppressed man, and now the fact that he's sitting in his right mind. He has burst the categories that they tried to contain him in, and so they asked Jesus to leave, to stop upsetting the way things are. And so now Jesus arrives back on the other side, literally as he enters his adopted hometown of Capernaum, and metaphorically as he's back with those with whom he shares commonality. Jesus can barely leave the boat before what seems like the entire town is there to greet him. And among that great throng of people was a man named Jairus. The day that Jesus had crossed the other side, Jairus' daughter had fallen ill. It started innocuously with a cough and a fever, but her symptoms quickly worsened, and she fell into a coma. Luckily for Jairus, he was a man of means and station. Say the name Jairus in town, and everyone had good things to say about him. He was an active leader in the synagogue. He wasn't currently on the session because he had just served 2 consecutive terms. But no worries, because the nominating committee would certainly put his name forward again. In the entryway to the synagogue, his name was etched on a plaque thanking him for his sizable donation during the remodeling campaign. He had a good job with a 401k that was growing by the day. He had premium health insurance. He had a large house in the middle of town that provided all of the creature comforts for him and his family. And so he gets a hold of the doctor, who quickly rushes over to see what he can do. And I have to imagine there was a moment of hope when that doctor crossed the threshold. The doctor was finally there, and he was going to figure everything out. But then come those words that crush all hope. There's nothing we can do. That's unacceptable. What do you mean there's nothing you can do? Jairus explodes in a moment of frustration and fear. I don't care the cost. Run every test. Whatever insurance doesn't cover, I'll pay for the rest. Just fix this. I'm sorry, Jairus. I suggest we make her as comfortable as possible during the last few hours of her life. Jairus' wife breaks down weeping on the floor, but Jairus isn't the sort of man to give up. He's not the sort of man to take no for an answer. And so the light bulb goes off in his head. I'll go find Jesus, he says to himself. Jairus had seen Jesus in the synagogue before. He witnessed him leaving the pulpit during his inaugural sermon and healing a man with an unclean spirit. He was there when Jesus interrupted the liturgy to heal a man with a withered hand. And so certainly Jesus can do something just as he has in the past. And so hope once again shines in Jairus' heart. And so Jairus runs to the house where he knows that Jesus is staying. You remember the one that belonged to Peter's mother-in-law? Jairus, out of breath, bangs on the door and says, Jesus, are you in there? I need some help. Peter's mother-in-law answers, wiping a dish with a cloth. I'm sorry, Jairus, Jesus isn't here. He and the guys all got into a boat earlier today, and they went over to the other side. But I'll let them know that you stopped by. Jairus can't believe it. Where's Jesus when you need him? My daughter is about to die, one of his own people, and he's not here. He's over there traipsing around with those Gentiles. And so he goes home and he sits at his daughter's bedside all night, grieving, fearful, praying, holding on to hope that the doctor was wrong and that she'll pull through this. And then he falls asleep at her bedside. He's awakened by the trembling of the earth as people stampede through the streets heading down towards the lake. Jairus manages to get a hold of one of them. What's going on? He asks. Jesus is back, the woman says, as she quickly pulls away and continues running down the street. Jairus leaves the house in a hurry, joining the great crowd making its way down to the shore. His daughter made it through the night, and now Jesus is back. There's still hope. There's still a chance. And so Jairus pushes his way through the crowd, although most of them moved out of the way out of respect for him. Jairus now stands before Jesus, and this powerful man, this pillar of the community, in desperation falls at Jesus' feet and begs for Jesus to come to his house and to heal his daughter. Jesus, my daughter is sick. She's about to die. She shouldn't have made it through the night, but she's still with us. Please come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well. I know if you hurry, you can save her. Please, 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 will you come with me? Jesus extends his hand to Jairus and picks him up off the ground and says, lead the way. As they start heading back to Jairus' house, the great crowd goes with them, and those city streets in Capernaum weren't very wide, and so everyone is pressed together, bumping into one another. Their route leads them past one of the last free clinics in town. Exiting the building is a woman. For 12 years, she's been bleeding. She was ritually unclean, excluded from the life of the people. She left the clinic that day receiving the same devastating news that she had received countless times over the last 12 years. I'm sure every time she went to the doctor, she was filled with a sense of hope that she would finally be given some answers. But every time it was the same. I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. Mark gives her no name, but for me, her name is Carol. Carol is my mom, and for the last 20 years, she's suffered from severe fibromyalgia. And I remember when she first received that diagnosis when I was a kid, and I remember how that daily struggle with chronic pain changed her, because how could it not? And I've watched throughout most of my life as my mother has gone to doctors and specialists, every time with a sense of hope that finally we would get some answers and we would find some relief. And then she would come home, and each time I would ask her, Mom, how did the doctor's appointment go? Did they finally find some answers? And she'd say, no, there's nothing they can do. Hope struggles to survive under the crushing weight of constant disappointment. And so I wonder if somehow hope still glimmered faintly in the soul of this unnamed woman. I'm sure that candle burned low after she received that message from her insurance company that told her she was no longer covered. She was too expensive, too great of a risk. And so she spent all that she had on medical treatments. She didn't have anyone to advocate for her. And so now she goes to the free clinic to get some help. The doctors aren't as good, but that didn't really matter all that much, because even when she saw the best doctors and the best specialists, her condition continued to grow worse and worse. She was, in so many ways, the exact opposite of Jairus. She was a nobody, nameless, penniless, a ritually unclean pariah. I doubt anyone really knew who she was, and I suspect even fewer cared. And so she leaves the clinic after yet another disappointment to see that Jesus is in the midst of that mass of humanity in the streets of Capernaum. Hope, almost extinguished, suddenly finds new life. Maybe she can touch his cloak and be healed. And so she begins struggling her way through that great crowd, pushing people aside, ducking under arms, and squeezing through small cracks in between the people. In an act of desperation, she reaches out. She stretches out her hand just far enough to graze Jesus' cloak. And then immediately her hemorrhage leaves her. She feels the bleeding stop. The healing in her body is surpassed only by the healing in her soul. All of those years of crushed hopes, those unanswered prayers, those failed medical solutions, all now viewed through the lens of this moment. Never again would she have to hear those words, "There's nothing that can be done." What that moment must have been like for her. But then the crowd stops moving around her. Jesus has stopped only a few feet from Jairus' door. "Who touched me?" he says. He's joking, right? The disciples whisper to one another. "Jesus, look at all of these people. We're bumping into each other. There's barely enough room to walk. What do you mean, who touched you?" "Jesus," Jairus says, "we're so close. Can't we deal with this later? Please, my daughter will die at any second." "Hold on a minute," Jesus says. "I felt the power leave me. Someone didn't just bump into me. Something else happened." As Jesus passes through the crowd searching for that person, the woman tries to find a way out, but now she's boxed in. She knows that she's broken the law. She's ritually unclean, and she's supposed to avoid contact with everyone, especially a man. All of that relief she's experienced comes crashing down in a moment of anxiety and fear. And so with nowhere to run, she throws herself at Jesus' feet and she confesses. "I'm sorry, Jesus, it was me. See, I've been suffering for 12 years, and I've heard about all of the great things that you've done, and I thought maybe you could heal me, but I didn't want to bother you. I didn't really think I was worth the time. Please, 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 can you forgive me?" But Jesus extends his hand, and he picks her up off the ground and says, "Daughter, you have nothing to be sorry for. You reached out in faith, and you were healed. You were healed not only of what wreaked havoc in your body, but also of what wreaked havoc in your soul. Be at peace and know that you are a beloved child of God and that you have a seat at the table of God's family." And so I imagine they embrace, and she goes on her way, I'm sure not only telling of the power of Jesus to heal and to save, but the power of his mercy and love that reaches out in moments of desperation. After she leaves, from the other direction come members of Jairus' household. "Jairus, your daughter has passed. I'm so sorry." But there's no reason to bother Jesus anymore. there's nothing that can be done. Jairus, who had been filled with so much hope, now is filled with distress and grief. And I wonder if he was mad at Jesus. They were so close, and if Jesus hadn't stopped to help that nameless, penniless pariah, if he hadn't gone that night before and was out gallivanting with the Gentiles, maybe he would have healed his daughter in time. But he says to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, only believe, take me to her." There's still hope. Jesus arrives and leaves everyone but Peter, James, and John outside, and he enters the house to find people weeping and wailing and making a grand spectacle of their grief. And he says, "Why are you all crying and carrying on like this? Don't you know that she's not dead, but she's sleeping?" Now, when I was a student chaplain, and we were instructed about how to talk to people in moments of grief, and when someone's loved one had passed away, on the list of things that were unacceptable to say was, "They're not actually dead, they're only sleeping." Read the room, Jesus. And the people all laugh at him, as if to say there's nothing that can be done. But Jesus has had enough with all of this, and so he sends them all outside. And he goes into the room with Jairus and his wife and 3 of his disciples, and he looks down at the young girl, lifeless in her bed. And he takes her by the hand and he says, "Little girl, get up." And immediately she gets up, and Jairus and his wife are amazed. And he gets down on one knee and he hugs his little girl. He's overcome with amazement and relief. But then Jesus says, "Shh. Don't tell anyone what you've seen." But you know who's going to talk about what happened that day? Jairus and his entire household, who knew that that young girl was dead and now she's alive. How could they not talk about it? But I wonder if Jairus and his family didn't only tell the story of how Jesus saved their daughter, but also about how he saved that woman, who needed God's healing touch just as much as they did. Did they, in telling of their desperation, also tell of her desperation? The woman who was unlike them in so many ways, but a recipient of the same salvation. Because really, for all that separated them, wealth and poverty, privilege and marginalization, clean and unclean, male and female, they both found themselves in desperation. They both found themselves holding on to hope. And they both found themselves at the feet of Jesus. And so I wonder if Mark writes the story down the way he does, because that's how it was passed down from Jairus. I wonder if when Jairus talked about what happened that day, he also talked about that woman. Maybe what Jairus saw and experienced wasn't only the healing of hemorrhages and the raising of children from the dead, but the healing of the great divide that separates human beings from one another. Because now embedded in his story of success, of wealth and respect, was the story of this unclean, poor, nameless woman. I wonder if that's the story Jairus told. And I hope that it's one that we can tell. Amen. I invite you to rise as you are able, as we will sing hymn 394, "There is a Balm in Gilead."